Okay, so let me then begin by summarizing the proposal for comparing the microscopic and the macroscopic degeneracies. Okay, so here is the form. So this is of course obtained by counting. Okay, and the idea is that what macroscopic quantity we should compute to compare with this microscopic counting, and the proposal is that this quantity is given as a sum of contribution from several terms. Okay, each term represents a specific contribution from an n-centered black hole, okay, where n could be 0 or any number. Okay. And for a given n-centered configuration, we first of all have the product of the degeneracies from each horizon, which I have written down here, and then you can have some contribution from the haired degrees of freedom, okay, and then you sum over all possibilities. Okay. First of all, you sum over all possible distribution of charges between the horizon and the hair, keeping the total charge fixed, and then you also sum over all possible numbers of black holes. Okay. And finally, the expression for the d horizon, okay, is given by this path integral. Okay. Here what explicitly appears are only the electric charges, but of course the magnetic charges are hidden in the background that on which you have to perform this path integral, okay, as fluxes through compact dimensions. Okay. Now before we can go on and try to compare this with a microscopic quantity, okay, we have to ask the following question, that what I have described so far looks like an expression for the degeneracy, because after all the entropy, okay, is always the log of the degeneracy, right, and the Bekenson-Hawking formula is supposed to be the log of the degeneracy, and also the argument based on the ADS-CFT correspondence also counted just directly the degeneracy of states. Okay. On the other hand, on the microscopic theory, we often compute the index rather than the degeneracy, because this is what is protected against quantum corrections. So in order to be able to compare degeneracy, a macroscopic and a microscopic computation, we have to somehow take the macroscopic answer that we have for the degeneracy and convert it to an answer for the index.
Ashok,
yes.
True that degeneracy and index is the same thing for ground state?
No, it is not in general true, because there may be more states in the ground state which cancel, right, and in the degeneracy it will get counted, but in the index it will not get counted. Okay. So just to be specific, we will focus on the case of 4-dimensional black holes, but this general argument can be extended to also higher dimensions. So in 4-dimensional black holes, the index that we calculate is what is known as the helicity trace index, okay, which is defined here, B2n. Okay. This is a trace, okay, of -1 to the power 2h, where h is the helicity or at the J3 eigenvalue, okay, J3 being the third component of the angular momentum, weighted by a factor of 2h to the power 2n. Okay. What is this number n? Okay, if you are considering, if you are analyzing a BPS state which has 4n broken supersymmetry generators, then you put a factor of 2n here. Okay, so it is half the number of broken supersymmetry generators. Okay. And you can see that if we set n equal to 0, okay, in particular B0 is nothing but the Witten index, right, because it is trace of -1 to the power 2h, where this is the same as -1 to the power f. And this trace is taken over sectors with fixed charges, okay, fixed electric and magnetic charges, by you sum over all angular momentum, as you can see from here. So if we want to, if we have gotten a computation of B to n on the microscopic side, okay, and this is what we normally compute on the microscopic side, we have to somehow be able to calculate this object also on the black hole side. Okay, and this is the problem we will try to address now, how to compute this quantity on the black hole side.
So sorry, the sum, the trace, what you said is that it's a sum over states of fixed charges, but
all angular momentum, yes.
But maybe I am confused, but I thought earlier you were lumping angular momentum
with the charges, yes. So now we keep, yes, now we separate it. We keep the electric and magnetic charges fixed. Okay. See that the d horizon expression that I gave, that calculated the number of states for a given set of charges and angular momentum, right. but now to this index requires that you should sum over angular momentum, right. So, somehow you have to use that knowledge of d horizon to.
So, it requires that you sum over angular momentum and also it is an index. So, these are two separate facts, right?
Yeah, the computation of the index requires you to sum over angular momentum because it is like Witten index, trace of -1 to the f, we sum over bosons and fermions, right. So, in a sense you are already summing over various angular momentum states, right. If you
one could imagine a more restricted index, right?
well, if you fix the angular momentum, then it will not be an index, right, because then it is either bosonic or fermionic.
Okay, but you could fix the angular momentum within a half, I mean some pair of.
Yes. So, in 5 dimension when there are more than one angular momentum components, right, you can fix one angular momentum and sum over the other. So, there are more refined indices, but in 4 dimensions you have to basically there is only one angular momentum, right, one SU2 and you sum over the.
But it's always true that an index has at least one less chemical potential than the full partition.
Yes, typically, because you have to sum over something. Yeah. Okay. So, let us now go ahead and try to ask how can I compute this index on the black hole side. Okay. So, let us examine this quantity in a little more detail. So, here was -1 to the 2h to the power n. This is the one which inserted the object which we inserted into the trace. Okay. Now, if you have a generic n-centered black hole configuration, okay, where the total angular momentum is distributed between the horizon and the here degrees of freedom, then of course, h is a sum of h horizon plus h here, where h horizon is the sum of the contribution from all the horizons. Okay. So, this quantity over here can be expanded like this, okay, and then inserted into the trace. Okay. Now, let us ask the question that why do we need this factor of 2h to the power 2n? Okay. What is the requirement of inserting this factor? Why, for example, couldn't we calculate Witten index, right? What would have happened if we had just calculated the Witten index? Okay. What happens if you try to compute the Witten index is that the result is 0, okay, and the result is 0 because typically the black hole comes in supermultiplets and the supermultiplet contains both fermionic and bosonic states, right. And so, when you sum over -1 to the f over all members of a supermultiplet, you will just get a 0 result. Okay. More generally, what we can show is that for every pair of broken generators, okay, we have a fermion 0 mode that has to be absorbed by inserting a factor of 2h. Okay. That is the need for inserting this 2h to the power 2n factor here. Okay. If n was anything less than the number of broken supersymmetry generators, you will get a 0 answer. Okay. So, it is not, it is trivial. If n is too large on the other hand, then you will get contribution from BPS and non-BPS states, and again it is not useful. Okay. So, that is why you always choose n in this specific fashion. Okay. So, then knowing that this factor is required for absorbing the fermion 0 modes, okay, we can ask where are the fermion 0 modes for a generic black hole solution. Okay. And as I told you earlier, for a black hole solution, these 0 modes typically always form part of the here degrees of freedom. Okay. The 0 modes lie in the here among the here degrees of freedom. So, you see that if we expand this quantity, okay, in a binomial expansion, okay, there are 4n broken supersymmetry generators all having 0 modes in the here degrees of freedom. Okay. So, get a non-zero contribution from the trace over the here degrees of freedom. Okay. We need to pick from this expansion the factor of 2h here to the power 2n. Okay. So, in this trace in this expression, we can essentially replace this expansion by simply 2h here to the power 2n, because all the fermion 0 modes are in the here degrees of freedom. Okay. And that of course simplifies the expression for the index, because that says that this 2h to the power 2n factor that we have here, when you evaluate it on the black hole, you can replace by 2h here to the power 2n. Okay. The dependence on h horizon comes only here. Okay. So, then the B2n for the black hole, if you want to calculate the expression for this index from the black hole side, it takes the simple form, okay, that here you only have a factor of insertion of -1 to the power 2h, okay, which gives the Witten index, which I denoted by I horizon, and then we have the B2n, the usual index calculated for the here. Okay. And in this formula, okay, although it looks the same, we should keep in mind that there is no J3 in this. Angular momentum has already gone into this, defining the index. Okay, this is still not quite what we want to achieve, because what we know how to compute is d horizon, right. what we have got here is the Whitney index I horizon. So, how do we calculate I horizon knowing the expression for the D horizon? Okay. And here we use another fact which is again known from experience, that if we take a 4-dimensional black hole, okay, again we are right now focusing only on 4 dimensions, but again this has a generalization in 5 dimensions and higher. If we focus on 4-dimensional black holes, then the black hole horizons always have H equal to 0. Okay, the supersymmetric black holes always are spherically symmetric. Okay, so there is no contribution to angular momentum from the horizon degrees of freedom, and as a result, the only contribution to I horizon comes from states with H horizon equal to 0, right? And for H horizon equal to 0, of course, that is the same as D horizon. Okay. So, for the spherically symmetric black holes, which are supersymmetric, we can replace I horizon by D horizon, and hence the macroscopic expression for the helicity trace index is given by this expression over here. Okay, we have just replaced H horizon by the I horizon by D horizon.
Sorry, that says that every state in the black hole has Jz equals 0, every state that contributes to the black hole entropy.
Okay. I mean, here of course you are working in the Euclidean, the D horizon is calculated using the Euclidean prescription,
yes,
right? But it looks like, yes, as if every state that is contributing has H horizon equal to 0, except that, yeah, okay, if you can identify saying that these are the states which contribute to the black hole, because you are eventually computing the index, right? And in calculating the index, states get mixed up.
But first you are calculating D horizon.
Yes.
So there you are really isolating the state.
Yes, okay, yeah, so I mean in the conformal field theory, if you want to ask, yes, every state is having D horizon, H horizon equal to 0.
And can you say the argument again? I didn't, just spherical symmetry of the black hole is enough to establish that?
Yeah, so H horizon, okay, is the, okay, how do we define the black hole charge, right?
Right.
This is like one of the electric charges, right? We take the derivative of the action with respect to the asymptotic electric field, and spherically symmetric black holes have asymptotic electric field 0. Electric field meaning electric field that is associated with the angular momentum.
But is this argument just about the average angular momentum of all states or of each state?
I think this, at least it looks like that this is a statement about each state, okay? And I mean, okay, you can ask, okay, this looks like a classical formula, right? Yeah, so why is it true quantum mechanically? But I think the reason that one expects this to be true quantum mechanically is because this follows from an algebra, okay? That, okay, normally, let me try to put it this way, that what is the assumption that the near horizon geometry has an extra SL2R, okay, that there is an underlying ADS2, okay, and what one can show is that the SL2R combined with the unbroken supersymmetries, okay, become an SU112, okay, a super algebra.
Yes.
That super algebra automatically contains the SU2 generators, the angular momentum generators, right. So, unless the configuration has SU2 invariance.
Right. But the statistical configuration that consists of the black hole could have that SU2 invariance by having states of different angular momentum that average to 0.
See, the black hole that as we saw always contains a fixed charge, right. Once you have fixed ADS2, you cannot change the charge. See, if you try to change the angular momentum, right, it will not be the same near horizon geometry. Okay, it will destroy the asymptotic field configuration, because it is like just like another electric charge from this point of view, right, from the ADS2 point of view. Okay, so the only issue is whether you always have ADS2 with spherically symmetric horizons, right, whether SU2 is necessary. Okay, ADS2 tells us the SL2R is necessary, whether SU2 is also necessary, and the point is in this case, because of the super algebra, okay, once you require that there is an ADS2, okay, you also have to have an SU2.
Okay. So Ashok, as a special case of what you are doing, you could have just considered single centered black holes, right?
Yes.
So then we don't have to worry about hair, or probably we don't.
No, even then we have to, because the single centered, the fermion zero modes always are part of the hair degrees of freedom.
But that's sort of the only hair.
Yeah, exactly. For single centered black holes, typically they are.
But there is it a well-known statement that I horizon is the, I mean that's here you are using it as a statement about each component black hole.
Yes, for single horizon centered, I horizon is equal to D horizon. Yes. Now, what exactly do you mean by whether it's a well-known statement?
I mean this is something that sort of.
See, if you just calculate the microscopic result, right? microscopic result of course has many states. Okay. The question is whether in the limit when it becomes a black hole, right, when you switch on the coupling, right, what are the states which survive, right. So, it is certainly not well known, I mean it is not even. Okay.
No, I don't mean well known in that sense. I mean that in some, comparison. So basically, this argument is going in the direction that degeneracy calculated, absolute degeneracy calculated on the black hole side will match with index calculated on microscopic side.
Yes.
So that, I mean, I'm just wondering if that is something we have experience of. I guess it.
Well, yeah, I mean the fact that the black hole entropy.
It's already part of the old entropy.
Exactly, exactly. Because previous argument was that somehow the index and the degeneracy will differ by a small amount.
Right. This seems to say that they're really not. They don't even differ by.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that's something new statement about that.
Yeah.
I mean, it applies to Strominger-Vafa, for example.
Yeah, it applies to Strominger-Vafa, and this gives you, okay, let me put it this way, that this viewpoint gives you one more check than what was done earlier, okay, which is a sign. Okay, so this says, see, d horizon is always positive, right? Okay, so this says that I horizon, the index is always positive, right, which means all the excess states that you calculate on the index side. So the index must be positive, right, and this you can check from the microscopic side. Okay, that the index that you get is always positive in this large charge limit.
Now, there is no argument from the superalgebra. There is nothing in the superalgebra that forces supersymmetric states to have J equals 0.
No, because superalgebra by itself does not know about this SL2R, right? Because you see, it does not even contain angular momentum, right? The angular momentum comes in only when the superalgebra becomes the conformal algebra, which happens at the horizon.
But the near horizon superalgebra would force supersymmetric states to have, or maybe that's not necessary.
Yeah, it's okay. It's because near horizon we don't know what the states. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I see. So, but then from the point of view of the field theory, it seems like a very quite a striking statement that only J equals 0 states are supersymmetric, apart from the few that you can hate.
Yeah, but the point is, yes, here of course can change things, right? Because here degrees of freedom. So it's not a few states which carry angular momentum, right? Well, because I mean, if the hair, for example, carries some angular momentum, right? Then the finite fraction of the states carry angular momentum, right? But because you are multiplying this by the hair contribution.
But it's two decoupled field theories.
Yes.
Hair and this. So it's only in that other sector that you have angular momentum.
Exactly.
In the interesting sector, no state that has angular momentum is supersymmetric.
That's right. Yeah.
I see. Now, so some things also including N equals 4. 16 BPS black hole and N equals 4.
Yeah, 16 BPS, okay, one has to understand the superalgebra, right? Whether there is an enhanced superalgebra at the core.
That also has the SL2R.
Yeah, that has SL2R, but how does it combine with the unbroken supersymmetries is what one has to check.
So maybe it was too little.
Yeah, it may be too little supersymmetry to.
You don't typically get much R. It's the R symmetry
Yeah,
one.
exactly, because we need an SU2R symmetry to give this argument.
16th I'm pretty sure I won't get SU2, you'll get U1 and maybe
Yeah.
or nothing. Yeah, okay.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, so what we are going to do now is to compare the macroscopic index computed using this prescription, the microscopic index, in some specific example. Okay, so the example that I will be taking, okay, is one of n equal to 8 supersymmetric compactification, type 2B string theory on a 6-dimensional torus, okay, but which I will denote by T4 times a product of two circles, because these two circles will play some special role in the way we will do the analysis. Okay. So, in this theory we will focus on a special class of states which consists of D5, D3 or D1 branes, okay, but they wrap the cycles of T6 in a very specific fashion. Okay. So, they wrap 4, 2 or 0 cycles of T4. So, along T4 it has only even number of tangent directions, and then it has one direction either along S1 or S1 tilde. Okay. So, this of course does not exhaust all possible D brane configurations in this theory, but a class of D brane configurations, but we will be focusing on this class of states. Okay. Q is a d Brane charge. So, we will denote by Q the d Brane charge wrapped on 4 2 or 0 cycles of T4 times S1 tilde, and by P the d Brane charges wrapped on 4 2 or 0 cycles of T4 times S1. Okay, this will be my definition. I mean, here it looks like Q and P as if they are electric and magnetic charges, but as far as this duality frame is concerned, they do not have anything to do with electric and magnetic charges. Okay, in a dual frame, they appear as electric and magnetic charges, but that is not relevant for what we are going to do. Okay. So, Q and P are each 8 dimensional vectors, because you can count the total number of even cycles of T4, and that is 8, right, 1 0 cycle, 1 4 cycle and 6 2 cycles. So, Q and P will be each 8 dimensional vectors, okay, and this is important. Q denotes d Brane charge wrapped on S1 tilde and P denotes d Brane charge wrapped along S1.
So, I think you mean here when you say wrapped on 4 2 0 cycles of T4 cross S1, you mean it's always wrapped on S1?
Or S1 tilde. See Q, yes, Q is always wrapped on S1 tilde.
The bracket is, I see, wrapped on 4 2 0 cycles of T4 and wrapped on S1 or S1.
Exactly, because 2B has even branes, right. So, D5, D3 or D1, right, either wrapped on one of the circles and an even cycle of T4. Okay, and here I have just divided them into two parts, right. Q will denote the d Branes which are wrapped on S1 tilde and P will denote the d Branes which are wrapped on S1. Okay, so here is a note, the Q that we used earlier now stands for this pair QP. Okay, J is not going to be in the picture because we are dealing with index, okay, and index we have already summed over J. Okay, so there is no angular momentum hidden anywhere. Okay, so these states are 1/8 BPS. Okay, that means they break 7/8 of the supersymmetries, 28 of the 32 supersymmetries. So it's clear what the relevant helicity trace index that you should compute is B14, right? Because if you have 4n broken supersymmetry generators, you calculate B2n. Okay, so B14 is the microscopic 14th helicity trace index of 1/8 BPS states carrying charges QP. That's the definition. So what I am going to do is to give the results for B14, okay, to the extent that it is known, and then we will see to what extent that those results can be understood from a macroscopic viewpoint, okay, from using quantum entropy function and other features. Okay. Now, one advantage of looking at n equal to 8 theories or n equal to 4 theories is in this case only single centered black holes contribute to the index. Okay. In fact, n equal to 4 sometimes 2 centered black holes contribute, but in n equal to 8 in the relevant region where the black hole description is good, one can show that only single centered black holes contribute to the index. Okay. And furthermore, for black holes that consist of only d Brane charges, okay, one expects that the only here degrees of freedom are fermion 0 modes associated with broken supersymmetry, okay, because typically the non-trivial here carries momentum along some internal circles, okay, and here of course you do not allow any momentum charge, okay, you only allow states to carry d Brane charges. So, the here degrees of freedom are somewhat trivial, okay, they carry no charge, they have B14 equal to 1 because the only degrees of freedom are the fermion 0 modes. So, B14, I mean in the definition of B14 I included various normalization factors, those are adjusted precisely so that if the only fermion 0 modes are the ones that are coming from broken supersymmetry generators, then B14 is normalized to 1. Okay, so then the total microscopic or total macroscopic B14 is directly the horizon entropy. Okay. So, on the macroscopic side, then quantum entropy function will directly compute the index. Okay, so that is why this case is simpler, we do not have to worry about multi-centered black holes here and so on. Okay. So, if we know the index, we can try to reproduce that answer from the macroscopic viewpoint by directly calculating the quantum entropy function.
Sorry Ashok, I briefly faded out. Why do only single-centered black holes contribute to the index in this case?
Okay, in this case what one finds is that if we, okay, I mean this is somewhat of a technical point, that the black holes arise only when this discriminant is positive, right, this q, the analog of q square p square minus q dot p square, okay, and when the discriminant is positive there is no wall crossing phenomena, okay. Typically if you take multi-centered black hole configuration, it has too many fermion 0 modes, okay, and that makes the index vanish.
That's a general factor of n equals 8.
Yeah, that is a general factor of n equal to 8 supersymmetric theories. Okay. So, there are some 2 center black holes that contribute, but those are negative discriminant. Okay. So, they are not what we normally consider black holes, and by if we just fix the charges so that the black hole forms, right, so that you can actually describe this as a black hole, then you do not have to worry about those states. Okay. So, we are going to give the expression for B14, okay, but before that let me say a few words about the duality symmetries of this theory. Okay. So, this is type 2b string theory compactified on a 6 dimensional torus. So, this gives you in a low energy n equal to 8 supergravity in 4 dimensions. The full U duality group in this theory is known as E77Z. Okay. It is a discrete subgroup of the non-compact version of E7. Okay. But fortunately, we are not going to deal with that here. Okay. The T duality group of this is SO66Z, which is not hard to understand. It is a 6 dimensional torus. Okay. So, you have an SO66Z T duality group. Okay. Now, for our analysis, what we will do is to look at a subgroup of this SO66Z. We are not going to make use of the full SO66Z. Okay. We will look at a subgroup, okay, which is SO44Z times SL2Z. So, let me explain what these are. So, SO44Z, okay, is a T duality group associated with T4, okay, and SL2Z is the T duality group that is associated with the global diffeomorphism of the torus labeled by S1 and S1 tilde. Okay, that will be my definition. And the reason that we have picked this subgroup, okay, one of the reasons that we have picked this subgroup is because this takes a D-brane configuration of the type that we introduced earlier and takes it to another D-brane configurations of the same form. Okay. Otherwise, if you take a generic T duality, let me go back a little. See, if you look at this a D-brane configuration of this type, right, and if you make a general T duality transformation on the torus, okay, what will happen is that you may get D-branes which do not wrap either S1 or S1 tilde, right, so it will not fall into this class, okay, or you may get D-branes which wrap both S1 and S1 tilde, again that will not fall into this class. Okay, so, just to keep life simple, we will make use of only this particular subgroup of the T duality group, okay, which by construction preserves the structure of D-branes that we have introduced. Okay, are there any questions?
So, the charges that you are considering are 8 component vectors because of the constraint you imposed on the
Yes.
otherwise they would have been 12 component vectors.
Altogether 32 component, including Q and P, because I mean you can, it's basically there are 6 cycles, that a D-brane can either wrap the cycle or not wrap the cycle. So, that would tend to give 2 to the 6, but then you have to I mean take into account the fact that you can have only odd cycles, right. So, that cuts down the number to 2 to the 32. And the point is in principle it is possible to deal with the generic D-brane configuration of that type, okay, but the duality transformation laws of that is a little more complicated. Okay. That transforms in a spinor representation of O66Z.
That transformation is?
In the spinor representation of SO66Z. Okay. So, it is I do not think much has been understood about what I mean how the duality group acts on this and which states are related to which states by duality transformation and so on.
Unlike the n=4 compactification where the SO622 is the same as the vector representation.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. So, this is summarizes, okay, essentially our understanding of the spectrum for this class of states. Okay. So, let me go through it a little carefully. Okay. So, first of all we have introduced these charge vectors Q and P, right. Let me remind you again that Q gives the wrapping on a D-brane wrapping an even cycle of T4, okay, and either of the 2 circles S1 or S1 tilde. Okay, or Q gives the wrapping on S1 tilde, P gives the wrapping on S1. Okay. Let us look at the cycle that it wraps inside T4. Okay. Forget about the cycle that it whether it is S1 or S1 tilde. Okay. Which cycle it wraps inside T4, that determines the structure of the vector. Okay. Now, there is a natural metric in the space of even cycles of T4 which is by the intersection form. right? You take two cycles, they intersect at certain number of points, okay? That provides a natural metric in this space, okay? It is not a positive definite metric, but nevertheless it provides a metric in this space. A 0 cycle, for example, intersects a 4 cycle at one point, okay? So that again provides a metric. So using this natural metric that is obtained by the intersection form of these forms on T4, one can define an SO44Z invariant inner products between these vectors, okay, which are denoted by Q square, P square and Q dot P. Okay, so this is just a way of pairing two vectors. Okay, given a vector, you have certain cycle inside T4. Given another vector, you have certain cycle inside T4, and you just calculate the intersection. Okay, that
matrix is some 8 by 8 matrix which you sandwich between these vectors.
Yes, exactly.
That's the analog of the L matrix.
Yes, in fact, it has the same structure as the L matrix. I mean, it has 4 off diagonal entries, right? 4 eigenvalue 1 and 4 eigenvalue minus 1. Okay. Now I will define two arithmetic quantities. Okay, these are called arithmetic quantities because they depend on the arithmetic properties of these charge vectors. Okay, and these are somewhat subtle. So L1 is an integer, okay, which by definition is the greatest common divisor of Qi Pj minus Qj Pi. Okay, so you first choose a basis in this 8-dimensional vector space. Okay, in the 8-dimensional charge lattice, a primitive basis, any primitive basis, it does not matter. Okay. Qi and Pi are components of the vectors Q and P in that primitive basis. Okay, so Qi's and Pi's are a set of integers. Okay, then you make all possible antisymmetric combinations of Qi Pj minus Qj Pi. So this is a collection of several numbers, and take the greatest common divisor of those numbers. Okay, that's what we define to be L1. Okay, L2 is another integer, okay, which you get by taking the greatest common divisor of another set of numbers, okay, Q square by 2, P square by 2 and Q dot P. Now we can prove that Q square and P square are even, okay, because this is actually an even lattice. Okay, so this again is another integer. Okay, so these are two integers which characterize the charge vectors Q and P.
Are these independent?
Yes, these are independent. You can adjust them. You can choose charge vectors Q and P appropriately, right, to get any pair L1 and L2. Okay. Now the result for the spectrum, okay, is known with certainty only for states with GCD L1 L2 equal to 1. Okay. Now the way I am stating these results, it does not look like fully U duality invariant, but there is a way to state this in a U duality invariant form. Okay. It is just for the purpose of presentation, I have focused on a description which is not manifestly U duality invariant.
You are saying the GCD of L1 L2 is U duality?
Yeah, you can write down a U duality invariant quantity, which for these charge vectors becomes GCD of L1 L2. Okay, so this condition you can rewrite in a U duality invariant fashion. Okay, so for these states, okay, one can show that the B14 is given by an expression like this. Okay, so this contains a sum over many terms, several terms. Okay, this sum is parameterized. Okay, different terms in the sum are parameterized by an integer s. Okay, but s is not an arbitrary integer. Okay, this sum is constrained by the requirement that s must be a factor of L1 L2. Okay, this is this symbol s divides L1 L2 means that s must be a factor of L1 L2. Okay. In particular, if L1 L2, okay, imagine that L1 L2 is prime, right? So for example, say L1 equal to 1 and L2 is some prime number. Okay, then there are only two terms in the sum, s equal to 1 and s equal to L2, right? Because those are the only two integers which divided. Okay. In general, there may be more integers which appear in this sum. Okay, now I have to explain what C hat is and what delta is. Delta is simple. Delta is given by this combination of the charges. Okay, and C hat, okay, are Fourier expansion coefficients of this well-known function. This is the Jacobi theta function, theta 1. This is the Dedekind function. Okay, so you take this combination, and you can show that this combination can be expanded as a power series expansion like this, as a Fourier expansion like this. The coefficients of the Fourier expansion are what we are calling C hat. Okay. So this gives a completely explicit expression for the degeneracies of this class of states, okay, or of the index of this class of states. Okay, you can write down a simple computer program which generates this number C hat first of all, and then using that you can generate these B14s.
So without knowing anything about these left-hand side functions, you would think C hat is a function of two parameters K and L.
Yes, exactly.
You're saying it's only a
Function of one, yeah. Yeah, that's because this quantity is what is called a weak Jacobi form. Okay, that guarantees that it's function of actually one variable.
And this is somehow the replacement of the Igusa form for this?
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's much simpler because Igusa form has three variables, right? I mean, here it depends only on one combination and some arithmetic invariants. Okay, are there any questions on this formula? Okay. Now, since C hat is explicitly given, we can do anything that we like with C hat. We can either calculate this explicitly term by term by writing a computer program, okay, or we can study its asymptotic behavior, right? How does it behave for large delta? Okay, and this can be done by using a saddle point expansion. Okay, and here is the structure of C hat for large delta. Okay. So now, if we look at the expression for B14, which had this sum over several terms, okay, we can see that for large delta, okay, or when the charges are large, okay, the dominant contribution comes from the S equal to 1 term, right, because for S equal to 1 the argument of C hat has delta over S square. So, it is largest for S equal to 1, okay, and the dominant contribution comes from that term because for large delta C hat grows exponentially with delta. Okay. So, the dominant contribution to B14 for large delta, large charges, is given by the S equal to 1 term, okay, and that term goes as exponential pi square root of delta, as you can see from here. Okay. This agrees with the leading macroscopic entropy for this system, which is pi root delta. Wittgenstein-Hawking formula for these black holes gives you pi root delta, and that is of course in agreement with this. Okay. This is part of the various checks that you get the Wittgenstein-Hawking entropy reproduces the black hole entropy, okay, the microscopic entropy in the large charge limit. Okay, this is one of the standard tests and the standard examples of this correspondence. Okay. But our goal will be to use the quantum entropy function to understand the details of the generic form for B14, okay, including terms for S not equal to 1, okay, even though they are subleading. Okay, are there any questions? Okay. Now, one point I should have said that even though the S not equal to 1 terms are subleading, okay, we might expect that, okay, how can we see such exponentially subleading contribution in a black hole in the expression for the entropy? The important point, okay, is that they are special because they represent dependence on the entropy on some arithmetic properties. Okay. In particular, you could have taken two black holes. Okay. For one, this number L1 L2 has one value. Okay. For another, the number L1 L2 has a different value, but which have the same delta. Okay. Then the difference between the two will depend on these arithmetic properties. Okay. And whereas it may be difficult to find a small number inside large number, okay, once you are focusing on the differences, okay, how do these two black holes differ, okay, you may be able to detect a small number by itself, okay, and that is what we will try to do. Okay. Now, whatever I am going to do from now can be done for general L1 L2, okay, as long as they satisfy this GCD L1 L2 equal to 1 condition, but just for simplicity of presentation we will be considering a restricted class of states for which L2 is equal to 1, okay, because otherwise the formula become a little more complicated. So, let us see what happens for L2 equal to 1, okay, we can go back to the previous formula. All that happens is that this becomes just a simple S divides L1, okay, S now has to be a factor of L1. Okay, so this is the formula that we are trying to understand from the macroscopic viewpoint. Okay. We can simplify this a little further by using the fact that using SL2Z transformation, okay, a pair of charge vectors QP for a given value of L1 can always be brought into a form like this. Okay, so Q takes the form of L1 times some primitive vector, some vector of the lattice Q naught, P takes the form P naught, and then the GCD of Q naught and P naught, okay, is equal to 1. Okay. So, instead of working with the general charge vector, we will use the fact that the whole formalism of course has the SL2Z invariant built in, okay, that is just the diffeomorphism of the torus. Okay. So, we will use that diffeomorphism on the torus, on the S1 times S1 tilde torus, to bring our pair of charge vectors in this specific form and carry out the analysis for this form of the charge vector. Okay. And then given this result, we can always make an inverse diffeomorphism to get the general result. Okay. So, let me now describe the near horizon geometry. Okay. So, near horizon geometry, in this case there is of course an ADS2, there is an S2 because these are spherically symmetric black holes. So, this is a near horizon geometry of the black hole carrying the same set of charges. Okay. And then there is the torus, the 4 torus and S1 times S1 tilde, okay, and this is the metric. Okay. It is very easy to understand what this metric is doing. This is the ADS2 factor, okay, this is the S2 factor, this is the torus labeled by S1 and S1 tilde. Okay. So, x4 and x5 are the coordinates along S1 tilde and S1, okay, and this is the metric on T4. Okay. All these constants V, R, tau 1, tau 2, etc., they are just constants that are labeling the background, and they are all determinable in terms of the charges. Okay. The attractor mechanism fixes these constants in terms of the charges. You just have to solve, for example, the extremization of the classical integral function. Okay. The important point is that this is of course only the metric background, but this background also has RR fluxes, right, because after all they are representing charged black holes. So, the charges of the black holes will produce some Raman fluxes through the various cycles, okay. And the way the charge assignment goes, okay, or the flux assignment goes, is that the vector Q, okay, these represent the Raman fluxes through the cycles of T4 times the 3 cycle spanned by x5, psi and phi. Okay. So, what kind of Raman fluxes we have? We have a 3 form, 5 form and 7 form flux, right, that which we could have in this theory. So, the 3 form flux goes through x5 psi phi, okay. The 5 form flux goes through x5 psi phi and a 2 cycle of T4, and a 7 form flux goes through x5 psi phi and the whole of T4. Okay. That is the way. So, that is what Q labels, and the P labels the same thing, but the 3 cycle now is spanned by x4 psi and phi. Okay. This is the role that Q and P plays in this near horizon background.
These are just the directions, spatial directions transfers
to the D branes. Exactly.
The D5 brane gives you the 3 fluxes.
Exactly.
And one direction is somewhere, this is some radial direction of ADS.
Yeah, radial direction, the flux is like a 3 sphere, the D5 brane is surrounded by a 3 sphere, right, or a 3 cycle.
Right.
Okay, so that this is the flux to that 3 cycle. Right. Exactly.
So the radial direction connects the two, I mean in some, so that's the one that's not counted.
Yeah, the radial direction is the rho direction, right, that is not, that's not the direction in which you see the flux, right, it is the cycle that encloses the brane through which the flux takes place. Okay. So, this identification of the fluxes will be somewhat important in later discussions. Okay. I will come back and point out the important points later. Okay. So, now because this is the near horizon geometry, we already know what the classical contribution to D horizon is from the saddle point, because that we know is the exponential of the world entropy. Okay. And the world entropy in this case is just given by exponential pi square root of delta. Okay. So, this reproduces the leading microscopic answer, this I have already mentioned earlier. Okay. This reproduces the result for the S equal to 1 term, right, the leading expansion for the leading term in this expansion, the S for the S equal to 1 term. Okay. The other point is that one can calculate what is the type 2B coupling constant at the horizon. Okay. And that one can show goes as charge inverse. Okay. So, knowing this, we can already see what structure the quantum corrections will have. Okay. So, the quantum corrections, the leading term is this one, this is the classical result, okay. And then the quantum corrections will take this form as an expansion in inverse powers of delta, right. And in fact, the reason that it is delta to the minus half is the expansion parameter is because the coupling constant is charge inverse, okay. So, the g square, which is the expansion parameter, is charged to the minus 2 and delta is quartic in the charges, okay. So, delta to the minus half is the expansion parameter, okay. That is the parameter at the black hole horizon.
Why is there no constant term?
Well, B1, B0, sorry, there is a, okay, this should have been from n equal to 0, yeah, n equal to 0 to infinity. Yeah, right. In fact, there is not even a constant, not only a constant term, there is also a logarithmic term, which is also counted in n equal to 0. Yeah, okay. So, Bn is actually the n plus 1 loop correction, okay, not n loop correction, this is n plus 1 loop correction. So, this is a general structure, okay, and if you can do an n loop calculation, you will know what Bn minus 1 is. Okay. Now, so this is the structure, I have written it again. Okay, again it should have been n greater than or equal to 0 and this should have been 1 in fact. Okay. So, you can now compare this with the asymptotic expansion for C hat of delta, okay, and that has exactly the same structure, okay, and these coefficients are of course all computable, right. It is a simple integral and you can do a saddle point expansion, you can calculate these coefficients to as high an order as you like. Right, you can just write a computer program to generate these CNs. So, you see that this microscopic result, okay, gives explicit prediction of what an n loop contribution should be in the path integral over AdS2. Okay, and so in order to verify this, okay, what we need to do is to carry out this path integral over AdS2 times whatever the near horizon geometry to as good an accuracy as possible. Now, here you can see the appearance of a log delta term, okay. Here, okay, again even if we include the n equal to 0, it looks like there is a constant piece, okay. Typically, you do not expect log of coupling constant, okay, in a perturbative expansion, but in fact in string theory this appears quite often because of the infrared divergence, okay. Though at one loop typically often you encounter infrared divergence and in regulating that you encounter terms which gives you log of coupling constant, okay. So, one expects that this log delta term will come essentially from the infrared divergence, okay, which is of course regulated by the volume of AdS2, okay, or by the finite curvature of AdS2, okay, but that will produce a log of the coupling constant. Okay, so this is still a challenging problem, okay. Do these computations explicitly, they come with the Bn's in principle can be calculated explicitly because after all it is a string loop calculation, okay, and if we understand string perturbation theory well, you could calculate this explicitly and here you have an explicit prediction for what those coefficients should be. So, this is still work in progress, okay, trying to verify these expansions term by term in perturbation theory. Okay, what I am going to discuss next, okay, is trying to get an understanding of the terms in the sum for which S is not equal to 1. Okay, so, S equal to 1 we expect that the asymptotic expansion of that is going to produce this perturbation expansion around the original near horizon geometry. Okay. The question that we would like to address is what is the source of the terms in this microscopic formula for which S is larger than 1. Okay. These do not seem to have any simple origin in path integral over the near horizon geometry.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So when you set S equal to 1 and then you do an asymptotic expansion in 1 upon loop delta, why is it obvious that the S equal to 2 term is not sort of mixed up?
Because essentially it is controlled by the coupling constant which is delta, right. The GCDs, the arithmetic information, right, does not seem to enter that perturbation expansion. Right. So, that is the, so the question is how does the geometry, this path integral know about the arithmetic properties of the charge vectors, right. I mean it is some global information that you are trying to look for, right, in this, and what we will try to discuss is where can that global information come from, right, enter this path integral. Okay, so the claim is that this S, the terms for which S is greater than 1, okay, these are generated by new saddle points in the path integral. Okay. So, what kind of consistency condition should you have to check? Okay, if we claim that this is generated by new saddle points in the path integral, what are the consistency tests? Okay. And here are the 3 simple consistency tests, that first of all, these new saddle points must exist only when this arithmetic condition is satisfied, right, because this sum over S is only over those integers for which L1 over S is integer. Okay. So, this should be a natural ingredient in the construction of the saddle point. Second point, of course, is that the rule for path integral over ADS2, okay, times any compact geometry is that asymptotically the configuration must approach ADS2, right, because you have to satisfy, I mean, that is the rule for doing path integral, asymptotically it must approach ADS2. So, that we should verify that whatever saddle point you have constructed is asymptotically ADS2. And then the third check, of course, is that the classical contribution from the saddle point must be given by exponential pi root delta over S, because this quantity in the large delta limit has the form exponential pi root delta over S, right. So, that is the third check we should perform on the saddle points. Okay. So, now I will describe what orbifold we are going to take, okay, how to construct the saddle point. So, the idea is that the new saddle points, okay, which contribute to the path integral, okay, are obtained by taking an orbifold of the leading saddle point. Okay. The leading saddle point was the original near horizon geometry. So, take the original near horizon geometry, let me give it again. Okay, it is this metric over here and these Ramon fluxes, okay, these constituted the geometry. Oops. So, we take an orbifold of this geometry by this ZS group. Okay. How does the ZS group act? Okay. It acts by 2 pi over S rotation in ADS2 around the center of ADS2. Theta, if you remember, was the angular coordinate of ADS2. Okay. We represent ADS2 as a disk. This is the angular coordinate of ADS2. So, you make a ZS transformation on ADS2 as 2 pi over S rotation, a 2 pi over S rotation in the sphere. Okay. Phi was the azimuthal angle of the sphere. So, you keep the north and south pole fixed and make a 2 pi over S rotation, and then finally, you shift the x5 coordinate, okay, x5 was the coordinate along S1 by 2 pi over S. Okay. Why x5 we will see in a few minutes.
Here phi and psi are the polar angles of the two spheres, right?
Yes. Yeah. So, psi is the polar angle and phi is the azimuthal angle.
And for ADS you had some eta perhaps?
Yeah, eta was a radial, r and eta, r or eta.
R or eta and theta is the other.
Theta is the angular coordinate, exactly. Right. So, what you are doing is you are rotating on the disk, right, which is the ADS2, we are rotating the sphere, right, and at the same time you are transiting on the internal circle. Okay. Now, you see that at r equal to 1, okay, or eta equal to 0, this is the center of ADS2. Okay. At the center of ADS2, the shift in theta is irrelevant. Okay. So, let us see what is going on at the center of ADS2. So, at the center of ADS2, the identification is simply by a transformation on phi and x5. Okay. Theta rotation is irrelevant because we are rotation does not do anything to the center. So, we are shifting phi by 2 pi over S and x5 by 2 pi over S. Okay. And as a result, if we look at the cycle, the 3 cycle that is spanned by x5, psi and phi, okay, the Ramon flux through that cycle at r equal to 1 gets divided by S, right, because that cycle has gotten divided by S. You are just making a ZS orbifold, taking a ZS orbifold of that cycle. Okay. So, the total flux is 1 over S times whatever was earlier. Okay. So, this flux was Q. Okay. The Ramon flux to this cycle is what we had called Q. Okay. So, the flux quantization will tell us that this orbifold is well defined only if Q is divisible by S. Okay. And what do you mean by Q is divisible by S? Okay. Q, if you remember, Q had the form, we are using a representation of Q is L1 times a primitive vector. So, Q being divisible by S means essentially L1 is divisible by S. So, that is the first condition. Okay, this should have been L1. So that checks, that makes sure that this saddle point exists only if S satisfies that particular condition, right, that S must divide L1, S must be a factor of L1, okay, which is one of the consistency conditions we wanted to test. Now, let us check that this saddle point that you have gotten by taking this orbifold is asymptotically ADS2.
Why did you have the shift in the x5 direction?
Otherwise, it will be not freely acting. Right? Then you do not know what is going on at the orbifold at the fixed points.
But suppose we just looked at that orbifold, it would. So this orbifold, I'm presuming, has the same supersymmetries as.
Yes.
As the background.
Exactly.
Now, if you excluded the x5 shift, would it also? It would also have the same supersymmetry.
Yes, it will have the same supersymmetry at the background. What is not clear is whether this orbifold is consistent, because see now what is happening is that the cycle you again have this problem that the total flux to the sphere, okay, gets divided. Okay. But that is not directly a problem, because at the fixed point there may be some concentrated flux, right. So, whatever whatever lack of quantization condition must be satisfied by the flux sitting at the fixed point, right, and it is not clear that a Ramon flux sitting at the fixed point is a consistent background, right, whereas as long as it is freely acting, it is clear that it is a consistent background, it preserves the correct amount of supersymmetries. So, these saddle points are certainly part of the.
But suppose the fixed point one was also, it would have the same action as, it would also be a division.
Except for some additional contribution for a fixed point maybe, yes.
So could it be that the terms that you are seeing actually include contributions not just from the orbifold you are talking about, but from a class of orbifolds?
Which all, well, see there is already a class, I should have said this, because this shift in x5, okay, could have included a multiplicative factor of by k.
Right.
Okay. The point is, if you want this to be freely acting, that k must satisfy the condition that k and s should not have a common factor, okay, right. What you are asking is k equal to 0, right, which will have a fixed point, right. But if you want orbifolds without fixed point, you have a set of orbifolds with k and x not having any common factor.
Okay, so already you have a number of orbifolds, all of which have the same action.
Exactly.
So you can't distinguish the contributions of different.
Yeah, different of those, because all of them are ZS orbifolds.
Right.
Yeah.
So proposal is that the summating terms come from all of these.
Yes, exactly. Sum of all of these, because all of these are consistent, right. But the point is, unless q was divisible by s, right. If q, for example, was a primitive vector, right. If L1 and L2 are both 1, right, then these kinds of orbifolds wouldn't be present.
Which kind wouldn't be present?
The orbifolds that we are describing here, right. Because these orbifolds are consistent only if s divides L1, right.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So this happens only if L1 is non-trivial, right.
But I think, yeah, that's fine. I understand that. But you're saying that x5 not shifted is not in the consistent set of orbifolds.
At least not in the known consistent set of orbifolds, because x5 not shifted, right, will require that there are some Ramon fluxes at a fixed point.
But so there could be a twisted sector or something associated with that.
Yeah, except that when there is a concentrated flux at the fixed point, the rules are very unclear.
But there are systems where you have Ramon flux concentrated at the fixed point.
Yeah, but very special kind. See, the kind that one knows have the property that their square is 0, right, the null orbifold. Because typically, how do you get Ramon flux? Okay, how do you get NS flux, for example, right? You shift along some circle, okay, but that produces a magnetic charge, okay, which is null, right, because just a winding, pure winding charge.
So you can get NS flux just in a conventional orbifold, just in wherever there is a ALE space that can be blown up.
That is not flux.
Not flux.
See, that is a yeah. So here you are really talking about the flux, yeah. Yeah, so what you are talking about is moduli, right, that constant P field, for example, yeah. But here you are talking about a free form or some form flux concentrated there, right. So naively this will have infinite energy, right, because you are trying to put in a lot of flux in a small volume, right, but that of course stringy corrections of course will presumably take care of it if it's a consistent orbifold.
And did you explain why x5 is not x4?
Yeah, so because if you do x4, right, then instead of q it will be p, right, but p, the choice p is primitive, right, so you can only do it with x5. Now, let me go through this a little quickly. So the point is that normally, if we take a flat space and if we take an orbifold like this, right, Z as orbifold, which acts on space time, okay, the space will not be asymptotically the same, right? It will have some conical asymptotics, right? ADS2 is different. Okay, in ADS2, what one will try to see in these two pages is that if we this orbifold, even though it looks like it's changing the asymptotic structure of space time, by coordinate change, you can recover the original ADS2. Okay, so let's see how that happens. So here, what I have done is that I have written the original ADS2 metric, okay, just denoted them by tilde variables. Okay, I have not done anything else. Okay, because we will just go to make a change of variables to the untilde variables. So this is exactly the same as the original ADS2 metric, but written in terms of tildes. Okay, some coordinates have been changed to tildes. The only difference that the orbifold makes is that now there is a new identification, but like this, right? This is the orbifold action. Again, I could have made it into 2 pi k over s. Okay, it wouldn't make a difference. Now, what we can do is that we just redefine our coordinates. Okay, theta is a scaled coordinate. Okay, r is a scaled coordinate in the opposite direction, and phi and x phi are some shifted coordinates. Okay. And it's a straightforward algebra to check that when you substitute these, when you re-express that original metric in these new variables, okay, you get back a metric like this. Okay. Now this of course is not the original ADS2 metric, but it looks very similar now to the original ADS2 metric. Okay, the one advantage of doing this is that the identification that we had earlier now becomes the standard identification. Theta equal to theta plus 2 pi. Right? No further identification. So as far as the identification is concerned, in these new variables, it's exactly what we had in original ADS2. So see, because of this, right, phi doesn't shift. See, phi tilde shifted, but theta tilde also shifted. Yes. Yes, that is true. So those are of course part of, see, this is the identification that is for the, this becomes that. Exactly. Right? And then the other phi tilde was periodic. They are separate. So those periodicities are also there. Right? So it basically recovers in this angular coordinates the original usual periodicity is recovered. Right? So this is just an image of what the orbifold action. Right? So the orbifold action basically says that theta is identified with period 2.
The orbifold action reduces to a trivial action.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Now this metric, as you can see, is not exactly asymptotically ADS2. Sorry, not exactly ADS2, but for large R, okay, it reduces to ADS2 because S equal to 1 of the original ADS2 action. Right? Exactly. So you can expand it in a power series in 1 over R square, for example. Right? So leading term will be dr square over R square, and then there are corrections which are down by 1 over R square, okay, which are within the allowed fluctuations at infinity. Okay, and you can examine this for each of these terms, and you can verify that they are within the allowed fluctuations on ADS2. So this has the same asymptotic behavior as original saddle point, and hence an adjacent saddle point. Okay, the final point is to check that its contribution to the horizon entropy is what we expect, okay, which should have been this. Okay. And indeed it is this. Okay. One simple way to see this is the following. Right. We are taking a ZS orbifold. Okay. So the total action of the orbifold is 1 over s times the original orbifold action. Okay. That is clear. The original action was, the finite part of the original action was s world, so now it will be s world over s, right, which is this. Now one might ask, what about the infinite part? Right. The infinite part should also get divided by s. Okay, that doesn't sound so natural because the infinite part should have been the same, right? If it's the same asymptotic behavior, the infinite part should have been the same. And indeed it remains the same because you can see that there is a scaling of this r coordinate, right? So the infinite term gets divided by s if we use r tilde coordinate. Okay? But when we re-express it in terms of r coordinate, the infinite terms gets back to its original value. Okay? So what to subtract doesn't change. But what you divide, what the finite part actually gets divided by s.
That's sort of guaranteed by the fact that the subtraction is by orbital.
Exactly. Yeah. That you shouldn't, I mean, for defined orbital, I mean, you are changing things in the interior, right? The boundary counter terms will change if you just change the interior geometry. Okay, so I think I'll just stop. I'll just slide, give this one transparency, and then I'll stop. So this gives you a general picture of where the various contributions of microscopic formula is coming from. Okay, the key problem, okay, to push this to completion is to try to do the quantum corrections. Okay. Now there are two approaches to this. One is that you try to do brute force quantum calculation, do one loop, two loop, and see how far you can go. Right? At least one loop, I believe it should be possible to do by hand. Okay, just calculate the one loop determinant in the ADS in the near horizon geometry and verify that he reproduces minus 2 log delta that comes from microscopic formula. Okay. But this is a more ambitious program, okay, and that is to reproduce the whole expansion, okay, around each saddle point. Okay. An idea is that using this enhanced supersymmetry, which exists in the near horizon geometry, one can argue that the path integral receives contribution only from configurations which are invariant under certain supersymmetric transformations. Okay. And this allows us to use various localization techniques. Okay. Whenever there is a supersymmetry in the background, okay, the integral can be localized. Okay. You can argue using supersymmetry that only a certain sub-configurations of the full path integral, full field configurations actually contribute to the path integral. Okay. And the hope is that using this we should be able to collapse the path integral around each saddle point into a finite dimensional integral, and then we can just evaluate it explicitly. Okay, so that's a parallel program, okay, which is aimed at getting the full microscopic answer from the microscopic formulation. Okay, so I think we will stop here. It's already 10 minutes past. Yes.
The system that we are studying is a fixed black hole in a fixed geometry. So, and it's asymptotic.
But the black hole itself produces the geometry. Yes.
Right. And the near horizon of that is a fixed geometry which is radius 2 cross
Something. Yes.
But what you're saying is that there's a whole other set of geometries, radius 2 mod
Yeah.
ZS, and radius 2 across everything mod ZS, which also contribute to the
Path integral.
path integral defining the edge.
Exactly.
So there's some physical significance we can give. I mean, the leading term comes from the true geometry, and the subleading terms come from some fake. They are not real geometry. They are not realized. They are realized as saddle points. There's no sense in which the space is really as understanding. Space is not really important. Space near the black hole never becomes really important.
That is true. But I think this is also this depends on how you do the counting. I mean, here you are doing an Euclidean path integral, right? And you are just simply trying to find a Euclidean path integral given asymptotics, right? You could have asked the same question probably for ADS-CFT correspondence, right? If you take a 3-bell, right, the near horizon geometry gives you ADS-5, right? But then within ADS-5 you have various excitations, right? It's not that you always get ADS-5. I mean, when you do the quantum theory on ADS-5, right, you have a lot of things in the interior, right? And only over summing over these that you reproduce the geometry, that low energy dynamics of the 3-bell, of the D3-bell, right? I think it's in the similar spirit.
Well, except that somehow you're lucky that it's only out of from
Well, no, these are only saddle points. So you have classified a set of saddle points which satisfy the supersymmetry requirement. Right? Those are obtained as orbifolds.
Does it suggest something about ADS-5 or some other system that we can classify some leading contributions?
Okay, see here the point is we are looking at supersymmetric partition function, right? I mean, you have a very limited goal that you want to just evaluate the partition function in this background. In ADS-5 you want to do more, right? You want to calculate excitations which break part of the supersymmetry, for example, right? And hence you have more complicated configurations. Right? Here, because you are focusing on just calculating the partition function, you require that it should have certain, the background geometry has certain amount of supersymmetry, and that narrows down the space of configurations over which you have to integrate. Right?
Because the fact that they turn out to be orbifolds is something very non-trivial. It passes some test.
Yeah, but the point is these orbifolds are definitely there in the path integral, right? Whether there is something more which satisfies all the requirements, one doesn't know, right? There will be other saddle points, right, which are also supersymmetric and which satisfies all the requirements, that we don't know, Right? In particular, this question of whether these non-freely acting audio folds can be made sense of somehow, right? At least for some choices of the charges.
If you mod out by a shift, it remains a circle.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Typically, a sphere, if you try to do an audio fold, it doesn't remain a sphere, right?
Right, but instead of ADS5 to the S5, you could have spaces which are multiply connected.
This was the S3 in the ADS5. So, the S3 at infinity.
Ah,
See, the fact that ADS2 has boundary of the circle has many advantages, right? For example, this conformal principal partition function being able to write as a trace.
The S1 as the which is the boundary of ADS2.
Yeah, because that is getting divided by this transition, right?
Okay.
But it nevertheless remains a circle,
Right.
and that's the first thing. Topologically, it remains a circle.
And so it's
geometrically, its radius changes, but that is just you just move the circle farther away.
So that's a special property of ADS2.
Yeah, that's a special property of ADS2, right? And it's also the same special property that allows you to write it as a trace over a Hilbert space, right? Which you couldn't have done for higher ADS spaces.
I have one question. So originally you started with extremal black hole,
Yes.
and then you took a near horizon limit, and you discovered that there are many solutions actually.
Yeah,
By this.
with that same asymptote.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you go backward actually this process, does it mean that there is a whole class of extremal black holes also? And each one of them.
I think one problem shouldn't fall in one whole class because we have the same charges, right? See, from the asymptotic observer's viewpoint,
Yes.
right, you will only see the total flux coming out. That's the same. Right? Is that when you go very, very close to the horizon, you discover that instead of closing in one way, right, there are many ways it can actually gap off. See, in the Euclidean black hole, right, you make the time cycle periodic, and then you see that as you are going in, right, it contracts to a circle. Right? Here also it contracts to a circle, but in that process it also does other things, right? You stay in the internal direction. Right? So these are maintaining the same asymptotic. These are different ways of capping off the geometry, Euclidean geometry, right, to a smooth configuration.
Any other questions? Shiraz?
Maybe a related question. There's no good Lorentzian continuation of these new saddle points, right?
Probably not.
Because time is sort of identified. If you think of the circle, well, one way of analytically continuing this was that circle was time,
Yeah.
and so you shift in time.
You shift in time, but so once you rewrite this in this framework, see, if you just think of it this way, right? Then asymptotically it has exactly the same form.
So even in Lorentzian space.
Even in Lorentzian, I mean, you could continue this time now in the Lorentzian, and you get some geometry,
Right.
right? The only extra feature is that it will, there are some Wilson lines. Right? So these features, these shifts, for example, and what are these? These are constant Wilson lines at infinity. Right?
Isn't there a time-like? Aren't you introducing some sort of closed time-like curve in this geometry in Lorentzian space?
No, this you will make theta non-periodic, right?
Won't be
So
closed.
once you go to a Lorentzian space, theta will become say
Infinite.
usually infinite time cycle.
But your orbifold was shifting in. Sorry,
Yes, orbifold. See, theta was
Identifying-
what is theta was identified to begin with anyway, right?
In Euclidean space.
In Euclidean space.
In Lorentzian space, it wasn't identified to start with.
Exactly.
But now you make an identification.
But it,
No, you don't think of this as an identification made in Lorentzian space. This is an identification in Euclidean space, but it leaves the circle is circle.
I see.
Right.
So then you
can
do that and
infinite.
then
unwind the circle.
You can unwind the circle again. Okay, I don't know how you have to do this geometry here transits, right? One can examine it probably in a little more detail, right? That whether this is still a non-singular solution, for example, right, in the Lorentzian space.
I see. If it was, then that suggests that there is a completely new. Then that's a new solution apart from the black hole.
That's a new solution, except that there is some imaginary component.
Oh, it's not real.
Yeah, but
Yeah, there is A0 which is imaginary.
that doesn't mean it doesn't contribute to the
Yeah, I
Lorentzian
have
path
a-
integral. Just 1 minute, right?
I have a question.
But it would be a physical configuration in Lorentzian space.
That's,
Yeah, I don't know. Right.
yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Ashok, I have you get some one loop correction.
Yes.
The log loop formula is like logarithm of area, right?
Exactly.
It's also considered to be universal for any black hole is what is known from general relativity and so on.
No, I don't think it is universal. See, because for n equal to 4 supersymmetric black hole, this factor is not there. See, I think it depends on what is the particle content of the theory. Right? Because it is coming from infrared divergences, you have to add up the contribution from all the fields that are fluctuating around the black hole horizon, and then you have to try to reproduce this result. So, if you repeat the same calculation in n equal to 4, right, from a microscopic calculation in n equal to 4, then you don't have a logarithmic term there. You have a constant piece, but no logarithmic term.
So BTC and various other black holes they had shown the 3/2 log area correction is my memory.
Yes, that is true, but that's in the context of special black holes. See, for every black hole in a given theory, you could calculate this. Right? But the point is you have to do the calculation separately for every black hole in every theory, depending on what are the particle content. Because this is really a contribution of infrared divergence, and various particles can give contribution to the infrared divergence. Right? Infrared divergence, or you can call it trace anomaly, for example. Right? But various particles will contribute to the trace anomaly, and you have to add up their contribution to try to reproduce this stuff.
So somehow I thought it can come from Wald's approach. Maybe I'm missing.
No, see, Wald's approach gives a classical result. Right? So these, if you try to think of, where it's coming from one loop, infrared divergent contribution. Right? Because logarithm of area, this kind of contribution is seen only by particles which are massless. And then you have to look at what are the massless particle content in the theory. Right? If there are no massless particles in the theory, then of course the black hole will not even see this. Right? Typically, probably what people calculate are the contribution from a metric, but in general there is not only metric but also scalar fields and tensor fields, formulas, and you have to add up the contribution from all of those and then see what coefficient you get. Because certainly if you examine the corresponding formula for n equal to 4 black holes, you don't have this term. Right? There is no log delta term there.
Thank you.
Shiraz?
Suppose you had one of these black holes within an ADS space. So we could look at a supersymmetric black hole in ADS 3 or the 16th ADS black hole in ADS 5. Now, in these situations, there are also gravitons that carry the same supersymmetry as the black hole itself.
Okay.
So I want to know whether in this situation the graviton partition function then would be part of the hair. So would you have configurations in which there's the black hole here plus gravitons doing the supersymmetric gravitons doing whatever they like outside?
Which are, you're telling me they can be described as smooth classical solutions.
They can be described as smooth. They're just metric configurations.
Yeah, if they're metric, I would think that they will be part of the hair.
They will be part of the hair, and the whole configuration will continue to be supersymmetric, right? The black hole here and...
Yeah, the point is, I have some confusion about this 116 black hole, BPS black hole seen n equal to in ADS. Because, yes, okay, you can say, okay, maybe there is some version of the formula which makes it quantized, right?
Right.
But I can ask, I can say the following, maybe there is some version of the formula which gives a pair of angular momentum which is on two sides and they exactly cancel.
Yeah, could be.
Right? So then the contribution from these black holes to the index will be 0.
Could be.
So it's not clear exactly how to, what to do with these black holes, right? Because of this property that first of all the explicit classical solutions do not give quantized angular momentum, and that doesn't seem to be a general principle which tells us what the angular momentum should be.
Okay, but let's look at then the supersymmetric black holes in ADS3.
Okay.
There also there are gravitons that carry the same supersymmetries as these black holes.
Yes.
Those are sort of cleaner, well-studied systems.
Okay.
So, I suppose what I'm asking is, if we were computing the partition function or in the conformal field theory, with the contribution, there would be a contribution where there are only gravitons.
Yes.
And then would there also be contribution where there's black hole plus gravitons?
In principle, yes.
So
that depends on, okay, then I have to check if in the presence of black holes whether these classical solutions exist.
Remain classical.
Yeah.
But it sounded from your decoupling argument that it should. Because
so, but the here contribution depends on what black hole you have. See, the point is, if there are non-singular solutions in the absence of black holes, right? There is no guarantee that the non-singular solutions will remain in the presence of black holes. See, you are adding terms, right, which is true. But if you look at this general formula, this here contribution depends not only on the charge of the here, but also what kind of black holes you have.
no, I agree. But there seems no reason for it not to exist, since these preserve the same supersymmetry, so they don't attract each other. So it seems reasonable that there is a solution where there's a black hole here and a graviton here.
Okay, if they are preserved, so are these of the kind which are non-primitive charges? Are they kind of parallel charges? If they don't attract each other because of supersymmetry, typically that corresponds to having them kind of the same charges, right?
Yes.
Okay, so these are like really multi-particle states.
Multi-particles.
Okay. Yeah, then I would think that you probably have to, multiply them. Yes.
Right. So if you wanted to produce the exact elliptic genus,
yes,
using your formula, you would have
to include the contribution of black holes times
gravitons.
Exactly. Yeah.
I see. And do you think that would be really a direct times?
That depends on whether the contribution by quantizing this here mode, right, is independent of what kind of black hole you have or not.
Right.
And it is not guaranteed that it will be direct product. Right. But the fact that we have to include these as separate factors is perhaps not so surprising, right? If you think of the partition function of gauge theory, what is known is that there is a BTC threshold, right? The black hole threshold, but there are lots of states below it, which are created by the threshold generators. Right?
Yes.
Now it's hard to imagine that as soon as you cross the threshold, everything becomes black hole, and even the excited states of these the excited states that are created by the LNs, L minus N's, right, are not separately counted, but they all become part of the black hole, right? That sounds very unnatural.
Right. It sounds like the right. Sounds reasonable.
So I would think that even for black holes, you have this extra factor, which gives the graviton excitation around it.
Right. And it doesn't. As you say, it's not guaranteed, but it doesn't sound totally unreasonable that there would just be a times.
Yes, exactly.
So it could be that there's this overall factor that contributes to the no black hole sector, but it's just overall outside, and then you sum the contribution from black holes and multiply.
There is no interaction here, between these objects.
It doesn't seem inconsistent.
I think that may not be true, because you see maybe there is a black hole contribution times something, right?
Yes.
But that times whatever it is, it need not be the same as what you get on the vacuum. Because on the vacuum, for example, L minus 1 on the vacuum is 0, right? So the Virasolo descendants on the vacuum are not the same as the Virasolo descendants on a higher vacuum. Yeah. So I think yes, whatever you get from the Virasolo descendants will probably be part of the gravity spectrum, right? If there are really gravitons sitting outside the black hole. But in general, they are not the same as what you get by acting them on the vacuum.
But how do you know which of these states should be considered as part of the hair and which inside?
Which of these?
So suppose you act by LNs of the black hole.
Yeah, see the point is, one hypothesis is that all the things that are created by L minus N's will come from the hair. Right? The black hole counts the primary degeneracy of the primary, right? And everything else will come from the hair. Right? That's what hypothesis. I don't know whether it is true or not. Right, but that seems a natural hypothesis that the gravitational excitations around the black hole will be generated by, will give rise to the descendants.
I see. Sorry, and one last question along these lines. Suppose we were looking at the zero black hole sector in your proposal, so just pure hair. Now, there are, in this sector, within ADS-CFT, to get things right, you need to somehow implement the stringy exclusion principle.
Yeah.
Let's say that we're in some sector where there's with charges where there are no black holes.
Yes.
So 1/8 BPS and N equals 4.
Okay.
Then we know how to get this right, but
you have to implement this extra principle. Yeah.
Right. So it wouldn't come by quantizing just gravity. you need to include D-brane somehow into the story.
Okay.
Yeah, so I suppose that should be part of your proposal, right?
Yeah, somehow internal consistency of the string theory has to be baked in, right? I mean, it's really doing string theory in this background.
And including non-perturbative degrees of freedom of string.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. Because quantization in a given background, right, will be the full string theory quantization, right? So whatever consistency principles govern string theory will have to come in.
Right. Right.
But if you think of it that way, then if you do the full path integral even around the no black hole state, then the black hole should be counted. Or
Full path integral around the no black holes. Yes, yes, that is true. I think that is true because what we are doing here is the Euclidean path integral, right? We are dividing the path integral into various sectors, right? Where the time circle is either contractible or contractible at 1, non-contractible or contractible at 1.2, 1.6, right? And these in-centered black holes are essentially giving that division, right? At how many points the time circle is getting contracted.
But maybe Sventa's question is how do you really distinguish the hair from the black holes? If you start including configurations like D-branes that are not really smooth classical configurations of string theory, I don't know. When do you stop?
See, okay, from the radius to viewpoint, right, the way you are defining the path integral, we have an asymptotic boundary condition which cannot be violated. Okay. And in the interior, whatever string theory has to do, right? Otherwise, the theory is not consistent.
Right.
Right. So the information about the fact that it's a black hole, right, is in the fact that asymptotically it is ADS2. Right? We are just dividing the path integral into two parts, right? One outside and one inside, right? And because there is a long ADS2 flow. Right? So the quantization of the theory in the near horizon geometry has to be done by thinking of this as a complete string theory.
But I think Shreyas is asking, what do you then count? I mean, for example, D-branes are solutions, but they are singular. Will you count them?
We count them through path integral, right? See, we are not counting D-brane. So in this sum.
No. I mean, I understand that, but when you sum over all histories or all configurations, will you include D-branes, which are in some sense singular configurations?
Okay. You have put the asymptotic boundary condition.
Yes.
Right? Now, you are supposed to do string theory in this background. Right? You do whatever string theory asks you to do. Right? Because you are trying to calculate the partition function. Right? So you don't have a choice of whether to include D-branes or not include D-branes. Right? You have to do the full string path integral in this. Right? But asymptotically it must be ADS2.
But what about singular configurations? I mean, do you include them?
Well, if string theory tells you that you have to include them, you have to include them. Right? See, it's a string path integral. See, you don't have a choice of whether to include them or not. Right? Because what I am saying is that once you have said that you are doing a theory of asymptotic ADS2 geometry, right? Now you are doing a complete string theory in that geometry. Right? It's not that you are now dividing that into parts. Right? This should be a consistent theory by itself. Right? You have specified that the theory is asymptotical ADS2. Right? And now you just do a consistent string theory in this background. And you don't try to any more subdivide that this is a contribution from D-branes, this is a contribution from something else. You have to sum over everything, subject to the boundary condition. Right? So this counting essentially is the full string path integral in that background.
Beginner, your proposals makes it sound like there's a very clean separation between those states that contribute, those D-brane states that are not black holes and those D-brane states that are. Which sounds somehow a little unnatural to me because you've got some complicated in the end the black hole states are also D-brane states.
Yes.
So we've got the D-brane doing something very, very complicated. As it gets more and more complicated, somehow it becomes one of the states contributing to the black hole.
Yes.
So, but there's a very sharp line in your way.